So thank you for that kind welcome, and it's delightful to be here, and it's wonderful to have the opportunity to talk about something that I love to talk about that I think is thoroughly important. So I apologise ahead if I offend anyone, or if anyone gets upset with anything I say. Well, that's a nice challenge for me. But tonight we're talking about Jesus, and before we come to look at images of Jesus, we realise that Jesus is a part of our history as Western colonial, part of the baggage of British colonialism, part of the repertoire of culture that Yugoslavian, Italian and Vietnamese people have brought to Australia. Jesus exists in and out of our culture. In some ways, Jesus is the example of the person, what it is to be human. Theological ideas present Jesus as the new Adam. What it is to be human? Well, we look at the life and death of Jesus Christ to, in fact, answer that. So Jesus is part of the cultural history that we receive. And in that figure of Jesus, we also see the Christ, what we understand to be the transcendent spirituality. So there's lots of stuff to play with, and Jesus occurs within Australian art in surprising and interesting ways. And so I hope that I would like to take you on a journey to kind of explore those kind of themes. So let us begin. The first thing to say is images are really important. We live in a culture that is articulated and sustained by millions of images. They are the flotsam and jetsam of our world. We in fact present ourselves as human beings through images on Facebook and other means. We are growing young people who are sophisticated image users, and part of the reality of doing theology or being church or thinking about this subject matter is that images provide us with a means of discernment. The what if, where does this lead me if I follow through the logic and environment that an image invites me? So I'm kind of hoping that you will enjoy and be entertained by this presentation, but you'd also begin to look at the way you look at things. Every image that we look at looks back and invites us to think about our assumptions, what troubles us, what offends us as we look at an image, and become perhaps a little bit more self-conscious about this apparatus of our eyes. What are we blind to? What do we see? What illuminates us? What makes us angry? What are the responses we make as a human being is triggered by our seeing. It's the prime function of the culture in which we live, to be managed, to live a successful life, to be happy. These things are all mediated to us by images. So this is not just about art, it's about having some understanding of what it's like to live in a media culture and understanding the way images work. So I'm drifting in and drifting out. Yes, can you still hear me? Oh good, there's no echo anymore. Oh, very good. So I shop, therefore I am, and I think that's a wonderful image to remind us that we use images in this kind of way. To be present in the world is to be an image, some sense of grooming and enhancement of who we are in the world as we've become an image in these sorts of times. So the subject of our kind of exploration tonight is this figure of Jesus. In the year 2000, the millennium kind of period, a moment of looking back on the history of the West and Christianity. The National Catholic Reporter, which is the major magazine, religious magazine in the United States, ran a competition for the best image that portrayed Jesus Christ. And so thousands of artists and illustrators across the United States and some around the world put forward images of what Jesus would look like. And I guess there was no parameters. Would it be historical or would it be present if Jesus was here now? So it was a bit slippery, so it's a little bit complex. But this is the winning image. And you know it's Jesus because it's kind of gold. It's kind of what you'd expect. Well, Jesus always attracts gold in some kind of way. But the figure is clearly Middle Eastern in background. Darkened face, the arms are outstretched. But this was deemed to represent this figure of fragility, a Middle Eastern origin. But the irony of this award was that within months after 9/11, people who looked like this were being arrested at the airport because they looked like the subject of terrorism. So this just raises the question, well, what are our assumptions culturally about what Jesus looks like and how Jesus acts and how Jesus eats food and how polite Jesus would be, and would he sit in our pew? Would he sit comfortably within our life expectations? The place I'd like to begin in exploring this is one of the fundamental questions for Australians in terms of this Jesus question, and it's about how we have imagined the Indigenous people of Australia. I realise it's a little left of field, but bear with me with this exploration. Part of the difficulty of arriving as British colonials in this Australia was this: who are these people? Who are these dark-skinned people who have no interest in our trinkets? Pacific Islanders seem to love the mirrors and small trinkets that they were traded, but Indigenous people in Australia took no interest in the objects they were being traded. And as Captain Cook and the other members of the team wrote about their experiences, there were these fundamental theological questions about who are these people? Are they noble savages? Do they carry humanity? Or are they people who are lost without God, lost without Christ? Or in some way, do they still carry the image of God? I think this is still a current question. There is still a question about who are these people? How do we hold them within the categories of our assumptions and our theology? Now, this little drawing could possibly be the first drawing of an Indigenous person by a European. So Sydney Parkinson was one of the people on board the Endeavour who did drawings that were taken back to England and then became the source material for the travel logs. Very popular form of literature at the time. These great stories, people who travel around the world to exotic places, and their stories were consumed by those who could read voraciously. It was fascinating for Europeans to hear the stories of what happens out on the edges, because it reflected, I guess, on their own sense of civilization and who they were. So here you have the first drawing of an Indigenous person. And what's interesting about this image is that the figure here on the left has a number of markings on its chest. This fellow has probably whitewashed ochre. You've probably seen images of that kind of ceremonial markings. But what's interesting is that this is a few weeks before Easter. They're on the boat. They're very religious. They follow all the rituals of prayer and Sunday prayer and the Eucharist on the boat, thoroughly cultured within a Christian form of religion. But here on the chest of this Aboriginal person is what appears to be a crucifix. Quite a shocking or unusual or unexpected kind of decoration. So Sydney Parkinson was a Quaker, very pious man. And so perhaps, because we don't know, conclusively, but here he's wondering about this body, this Aboriginal body, this black man, and whether he carries and bears the image of Christ, or perhaps he needs the image of Christ. This is one for whom Christ has died. So it just raises a question, and the artist and we ourselves can't resolve that, but it's a curiosity. It's a question which is certainly covered in the writings. Captain Cook contemplated several times about who are these people? Because essentially it offends your sense of identity. To find people who are other puts you in the position of challenging your own cultural assumptions. So there's a framework around in which this new encounter with people in Australia was framed. And this is also best exampled by this little drawing, which is two Aboriginal men. And I hope you can see what's glaringly wrong with this image. So this is based on original drawings taken back, and a lithographer has transferred them onto plates, and they become a page in a book. So this is meant to illustrate two typical Aboriginal people moving forward in battle. And you'll all notice that the Aboriginal man is holding a shield, a round shield in the style of a Greek soldier, and then in his right hand he has a sword. So this is clear evidence that people don't see. They can only see from their familiar viewpoint and work out what's familiar and then what's different. We all come with cultural baggage. We learn to see. These are the skills a culture or a family or a context gives us. And by the time this image was reproduced in this wonderful travelogue, they had completely misunderstood the actions of Aboriginal people, and they look more like Greek soldiers because that was what they knew. It's a period when everyone went off to Athens and Rome and did the trip to the continent and learnt about Greek sculpture and stuff like that. That was the fashion and the understanding and the apparatus. There are not many pictures of Aboriginal people that exist really after the 1850s. It comes up very rarely in Australian art and often carries a sense of nostalgia because by the 1850s, most writers in Sydney and Melbourne who were writing about the shifting nature of cultures believed that Aboriginal people were passing away. That somehow God had destined white folks to come here and to make this land great, and this was just part of the destiny of the unfolding of God's purpose. There was quite a virulent belief in phrenology, which is a spurious science which measures the bumps on your head. And if you have sort of a pronounced forehead, then you're more brutal and passionate. And if you're more intelligent and reflective, then you have more of a different shape on your cranium. So there was a whole science that was invented that could work out racial difference. It's a form of systematized racial marking where certain types are deemed to be more intelligent or less or more brutal or whatever. So there was a profound belief by the 1850s that Aboriginal people were passing into history. And the last few images we see of Aboriginal people are these kind of fading off into the sunset kind of moments. In 1991, Rosemary Crumlin, who's been a major contributor to understanding religious images in Australia, published this book. It was in association with the World Council of Churches, and in the High Court in Canberra, she put together this quite stunning exhibition of Aboriginal art and spirituality. It was a time in which all our national galleries were turfing out the first level floor and putting in Aboriginal art because apparently American tourists wanted to see it more than they did our Heidelberg school, summer, golden summers and other things which are far more pretty. So Aboriginal art became a commodity which said Australia, it's our exoticness, and was the beginnings of the movement of Aboriginal desert art and the popularity of dot tea towels and other Dreamtime accoutrements that you can attach to your life. But in this exhibition, she was able to find works that come from Indigenous communities that were still in touch with their traditional life. But many of them were missionary communities. The Catholic orders or Presbyterian, Anglican, Baptist had been working with Indigenous people for many years. And so you had this hybrid kind of imagery that was rising where people were expressing their traditional values, but also expressing their understanding of the Christian faith. And so this book and this exhibition brought to more public recognition these hybrid images that are both Christian and also traditionally Indigenous in their spirituality. It got a lot of criticism because it's watering down Indigenous culture. It's not pure. A lot of art critics thought it was a very uncomfortable development that Indigenous people could go on innovating and developing new models and ways of expressing their spirituality because, after all, they really needed to stay in the Stone Age because that's much easier to manage as a curator. In 1988, the first Aboriginal gallery opened in Los Angeles, in Rodeo Drive. And the American entrepreneur who opened the gallery had enough money left over to import 2 Aboriginal people to sit in a loincloth in the corner of the gallery and paint dots while everyone arrived at the opening drinking the best French champagne. So this is, problematic, but it's recent history. I even heard a story about an entrepreneur in Alice Springs who wanted to create the biggest dot painting in the world. And these would be big boulders, and he'd paint them white and put them out in the desert So you could have a helicopter ride, and then you could have a helicopter, like you'd do this helicopter ride over the landscape. You'd see the biggest dot painting in the world, and the dot painting is about the land on which the dot painting stands. So anyway, you can see that there are drivers that reduce the impact of those sorts of ideas. But there is this flowering with Indigenous communities, particularly those who've had a long Christian experience, where they're beginning to visualise in ways of integrity their understanding of the Christian faith. This is Marita Sambono from Daly River, which is was a Catholic mission, and this is the loaves and the fishes, the miracle of Jesus' reproduction. Wonderful image. To me, it looks like a big watermelon or an orange that's been cut in half, and it's kind of oozing out all this great liquid, sloppy dots, and that's the sensation. Or this kind of eye that's on a wave or something. There's this immediate impact of the visual construction of the work. But if you look closely in the middle, you've got these are yams, which is the daily food, and fish, barramundi. It's great barramundi country. So here's the food that Jesus has provided for the community. This is a rich tropical environment. The light is stunning. Everything shines with that kind of reflective capacity. And here is the people going away satisfied from this meal. So she's claiming not only to interpret or reflect on our miracle story, but this is her. This is her community. This is her experience, that God is the one who provides this rich feast from the natural produce in our thing. So God is here. God was here. God was here. God was here before. God is the provider. So a wonderful image that I bought from an exhibition and had it in the church when I was at Paddington, and from time to time we have it on the wall, or we would take it down and put it on the floor and gather around in a circle, because that seemed to be a much more appropriate way to gather around this image and be reminded that in the midst of struggles and scarcity, God is a provider. So what's interesting and challenging for us is that you have artists from Indigenous communities doing theology. They're theologically reflecting on their material culture and offering a perspective which is authentic and different and challenging in terms of the tradition. Here is an image by Hector Jandanay from Turkey Creek, again up here in the Bungle Bungle Ranges. Rover Thomas would be the most famous of the artists who've come out of that community. This is an early work. It's actually made from the ochres, so he's gone out and mined the earth, because the earth is what the means by which you read your connection to land. And he's boiled it up with gum leaves, because that's a natural form of turpentine and a glue. And he's bound the paint, the ochre, with these natural materials and painted it on. It's got that stained feel. So here is Jesus, and it's an ascension. So Jesus is ascending, and around the bottom are his disciples. And his disciples are painted in the form of the Bungle Bungle Ranges. Because if you want to know this story, you take your shoes off and you walk through the land, because you can see in the formations around you and what you experience through your feet a connection to the markings by which God is at work in history and life. But what's profoundly interesting is that this happens in this black void. It's like a cave. Now, when Aboriginal people understand when they pass away, they die, their spirit and their physical being returns to the land. In this community, bodies are put on a platform in a tree, and the life juices literally drop down into the ground and are consumed and soaked up, as it were. And then when the body is reduced to bones, the bones are then taken, painted, ochred, and then put in a neat slot into an overhanging rock or some place which contains their remains. one of the things that Aboriginal people found most inexplicable about the gospel was this idea that the afterlife was in heaven. Why would you go there? Why would you go up into the clouds? That was one of the big and challenging difficulties about understanding, if you live a good life, you'll go there. No one found that interesting whatsoever, because they were wanting to go back to the land, the mother. Conception is understood where the woman takes in the spirit of a child in this place, and so the child is named for its moiety and its connection to the particular land where it was conceived. So the baby is born out of the land, and then when you die, you go back into the land. What an interesting idea. I don't know whether you find heaven a helpful concept. I hope they've got a few hobbies going on there to spend eternity and make it interesting. But these ideas of clouds and light and stuff, it's a bit ethereal. Like it's a metaphor. It's not literal. So I'm finding this idea that my future might be bound up with the body of the earth, my body and the body of the earth. That's where I reconnect with the eternal God being present in some way. So it's a really interesting perspective, and this is coming from an Indigenous community, and it's a challenge to the way we have understood ideas of heaven. This is Shirley Purdy, and it's also an ascension. It's also from Turkey Creek, and again, Jesus with Mother Mary looking on the right and is about to ascend, but again, he's ascending into this dark black thing. And wouldn't black be the colour of holiness? Wouldn't the black be the most powerful surface? Because black's all about skin, and that's the skin of bodies and skin of the world, and the way light shines on skin. This flash. That's what's of great interest to Central Desert Aboriginal communities. The way things sparkle, because that's like water. It's like the presence of the things which are most fundamentally spiritually nourishing. So here you have a little journey anyway through the encounter with Aboriginal culture and the other, and it seems to me here are some examples of artwork which is putting forward or presenting to us a picture of Jesus, who is part of the land, part of the creation. It's quite a challenge to traditional kind of images that I'm used to. In 2008, Shirley Purdy won the Blake Prize, and she won it with this work, which is the Stations of the Cross. And it's huge. It was about this big, and it came in a crate. It was one of the last works we opened up during the judging process, and it had this beautiful filament of waxy paper, and went crumpled on the floor. And there it was, this amazing, beautiful big work that looks like Arnott's biscuits. It's sort of all crunchy, and it had this rich texture with these lovely creamy. And this is all ochres that are mined from the land of which she's responsible and connected to. So the fundamental thing she's expressing is that my sense of God, my spirituality, I'm in touch with it, with my feet and toes and my fingers. It's part of the ground upon which I walk. So it's quite a different way of understanding images. Being a Roman Catholic community, they mark the Easter period with the Stations of the Cross, and they've written songs. There are 12, 13, 14 songs that they sing as they move around the land, because the only way you can understand anything is to move across the surface of the land. And so this is her story. And it's the claim that, this is not your story, the missionary story, this is our story. Jesus is the one who is found in our kind of actual story. So when she won the prize, she travelled down a couple of weeks later. It was difficulty getting flights, and so we had a special seminar with her talking about the work, and we had all these very sophisticated art students sitting here on the floor. Art students do a lot of that with little pads and things, making notes and drawings, and so she was there with the art curator from the community. Beautiful woman. She must at that point have been about 60, but she looked 45. Beautiful, soft, dark skin. And I asked her, so I was just over there a little bit, just asked her, well, how is this story of Jesus' journey of suffering your story? Why is that so important? And to my surprise, and everyone's surprise, tears started rolling down her cheeks. And she began to talk about one of the foundational stories of her community, which is the massacre of Mistake Creek. And she briefly, which comes up in a lot of the images from Turkey Creek, somewhere around 1916, 17. Her grandparents' generation were on a journey, walkabout, and according to local legends, 20, 30 people were camped out. Word had got back to the local landowner, squatter, that they had stolen a cow, killed one of his cows, and had consumed it as part of their feast. So he hadn't had enough of this, so he rode out with a number of other people with shotguns, and they killed everybody gathered around the fire, so 20, 30 people, and took the lid off the pot, and it was a kangaroo. So this is marked as a terrible injustice. Imagine this small community where this many people are killed. Like, it's just traumatic, and it's a trauma that runs for generations. And so this story is about that trauma, about the land bearing the blood of these kinds of experiences. And in a number of works, they have a big boab tree, which is where the bodies were all gathered together and burned, and the evidence was tried to be hidden up, and one wounded woman crawled away and eventually was able to tell the story. So on All Saints' Day, Halloween, around that period in the church year, they all go out there and they remember their forebears, their ancestors, and they use that Christian story to mark that kind of marking. This is a lithograph that she's recently done of this tree. This is the big boab tree where this happened, and which they remember. And to me, it's sort of like two fingers, two hands, and it's counting off the people. Like it's that kind of numeric memorial for people. So as an art historian and as a kind of theologian, these are stunning, confronting, interesting stories of communities that are using visual means to offer profound insights into the way they understand God at work, giving grace and compassion in the community. So that's a journey from looking at Aboriginal people, and Aboriginal people now offering us perspectives and insights, and I think expanding our view of the way in which we understand Jesus Christ at work in the world. So the next little bit was just to give you a little insight into the Blake Prize. A couple of people would have seen just a couple of these images this morning, because the Blake Prize has been going since 1951. It's regularly come to Melbourne, offered in St Paul's Cathedral and other places, and it's Australia's great big spiritual art prize. It's fabulous, and it's like a circus. It's got everything under the sun. A couple of years ago, up to 1,200 artists every year were putting in work that ranged from Buddhism, animism, Hinduism, through to all sorts of strange and wonderful ideas. And having been involved with it for quite a while, I'm just stunned by the level of interest from artists and creative people, because there's also a poetry prize. There is a huge interest from people about religion and spirituality, what it is, because we live in a time where allegiance to traditional forms of religion is much looser, and people are more willing to experiment and pull things together that seem to work for them. It's more of a user pay kind of opportunity. You just download the bits you want, so you can be a little bit Buddhist and a little bit Christian and whatever. It's about practicalities often of managing the complex tensions of life. But in 1951, the Blake Prize was inspired by Matisse, who did a number of religious commissions in France. So wouldn't it be terrific if we could inspire Australian artists to have Australian Jesuses in every church, because it was a period in which a lot of churches were being built in the new suburbs around all the capital cities. So Justin O'Brien was the first winner, and he was terrific because he used Australian colours and beautiful, bright, summery kind of things. So the Blake Prize got off to a great start, and here he is, very happily receiving the prize. Really thrilled. He'd gone on a tour around Europe for 6 months and painted this work. Took him 8 months. So he was really serious about really wanting to win the prize, and it was so successful. It was deemed to be an annual prize. So there's the Mark Foy's ballroom where it was held, and here's a number of the other images that were in the exhibition, including Arthur Boyd, who painted this wild orgy of religious interest. Great white figure there in the back, and then people going about their business, living and reproducing and involved in war. And it's clear why this work didn't win and why Justin O'Brien wins. And so already, right the first year, the Blake Prize hits its problem. What is religious art? What should religious art do? Should it lift you up into a realm where everything's fab and groovy and lovely, or does it confront you with the world in which you live? Does it have a prophetic edge, or is it priestly and kinder to your soul? So there goes on a discussion looking and trying to find Jesus alive within the history of Australian art, because the Blake Prize did provide a reason for artists to do religious images. They don't sell, they're more personal. People, they're not economically useful to most artists, but the Blake Prize came along and provided an incentive for artists to win a prize or be commissioned to create a work. And so from 1951, the image of Jesus appears much more rapidly and more widespread in Australian art. And I quite often come across images of Jesus in church halls by local artists that were painted for the Blake in 1973 or 84 in a dusty corner. It did create like that kind of level of interest. But these are some of the works in the first 10 years that created quite a controversy every year. So this one's too Protestant, too introspective and about guilt, and how can Judas Iscariot be a religious figure? Where are the icons of Judas? But there he is contemplating, and this is the rise of existentialism and reflecting, I think, on the meanings of the Second World War and the Holocaust. Eric Smith, who great abstract painter who moved towards more abstract means, and there's his idea of the resurrection. So at this period, people interested in electrical ideas and atomic bombs and things. There was a kind of interest in the role of energy. But by about 1960, you had quite a flowering of interest in religious art. 1960, 1961, there was a huge big conference at the University of Sydney run by the Catholic Church. The Presbyterian Church started this thing called Artos, which would meet once a month and hire musicians and stuff. And so around Sydney University, there was a bit of a flowering of organised religion being interested in art. Paul Tillich is the theologian who was very fashionable at that time, who wrote a lot about the search for meaning in abstract art, and he was very conversant with those sorts of things. So Eric Smith, as a result of this increasing interest, this moment where art was going to get into churches in a contemporary way, he got this commission from St Paul's College in Sydney to create a stained glass window. It's every artist's great career move. I want to do a stained glass window. So he worked with this new technology, which was just being developed in France, where you would use big kiln baked blocks of glass, like pure, huge blocks of glass, set in a concrete wall frame. So the light that comes through is intense because it's coming through a very dense layering, so the blue, the red, amazing effect. And so he was the first person to import, boulders of this glass to Sydney and develop. The commission had a lot of difficulties. There were arguments in the committee and whether people liked it or not. It was too contemporary, and some people on St Paul's College said, well, we're a university college, we have to be at the cutting edge of culture, and that's the role of the church. So anyway, he eventually fulfilled that commission. And it's fabulous. Like you go in there and the colour is so dense, it's drenching. But the college is laid out with two lines of chairs, like the English college style. So they're all sitting in there, all the young fellows at St Paul's, looking at each other, being drenched by this fabulous piece of art. But it's a good example of the kind of hopes that Jesus could come alive through artistic means and be expressed not as a British colonial figure or Catholic from Yugoslavia, but this could be the birth of the Australian Jesus. The other artist who I think was really important in this period was John Coburn, and this is his winning work in 1960. It's ironic because it's the first year the Commonwealth Bank gave the prize, because Mark Foy's, the family who were involved, found that they didn't like the previous year's winner, so they pulled the funding because it wasn't religious enough, didn't fulfil their expectations. So this is the question that dogs the Blake, and has dogged the Blake all the way along, about, well, what is religious art? Well, it's what I'm used to, or does art take us? Does art open up windows to new expressions? John went on to have a fabulous career creating images which I think carry this connection between the Australian landscape and a sense of felt, tangible, skin touch spirituality that I can meet God in the land I move through. He admired Aboriginal art, he studied it, he puts together images of that are clearly Christian iconography, the cross, the communion references, the cup, the pattern, the bottom of the mandala, and these fabulous blue markings which represent the movement of air and birds. And your eye just goes around, staying within this field. Everything is okay. It's like an icon connecting our outside world with our inside experience. And as I said, an admired Indigenous art, one of the first Australian artists to really look at the way Indigenous art worked. This is his homage to Indigenous art. But John had a wonderful opportunity in 1960 to be commissioned to do a work in a church. So here was his chance to kind of make Jesus present in the life of a local community. And St Kevin's at DY, you've all have heard that great Australian saying, St Kevin. So St Kevin's was a brand new building, a new architect, and it's a 7-peaked ferro concrete building. So spray concrete on a skin. So it's got 7 peaks. So it looks like a tent. It sort of just rises above the shops and the homes in DY, not far from the beach. Still looks really contemporary. What a great idea for a church, a tent, and it falls down after 50 years and there's no heritage listing. It's a really good idea. But he worked with his wife, Barbara, and they got bathroom tiles and cut them up, spent hours. So as you walk into the building, you walk across these John Coburns made of tiles, and there is condensed these cross figures that are made up of references to the Australian landscape. He did the Stations of the Cross, and this is when the Good News Bible had just been published, and so he uses a very simple line-like form telling the story of Jesus around there. But you'll notice that there's a Belgium off-the-shelf Mary there, because the congregation has become more Italian in more recent years, and so you've got to have things which are familiar, and so they purchased the statue, and the flowers are plastic, because churches run on plastic flowers or silk flowers or whatever. There's a tension within the iconography of the local community, but quite interesting and quite a unique, and this is not often acknowledged in John's, when people look at his work, this is totally overlooked and not acknowledged. There he did the design for the steelwork on the little side chapel, so fish and waves is DY, perfect. And there's a picture of St. Kevin's sitting there. So a wonderful example where an artist gets to create an environment, spaces that you walk through over a visual way, and here are the symbols of the tradition made present in a sort of contemporary way. Wouldn't that be lovely if we could do that? One of the other artists who came to the fore in the Blake Prize, he's won it twice, is George Giddoes. And I put these two together because they're so different. John Coburn's the priest. He's the one who says everything is okay. He draws your eye into a world which is in touch with heaven. There's an order. God's got everything under control. George is the prophet, the one who takes you to the edge, the disruptor, has that function of really questioning our comfortableness. He won the Blake Prize in 1995 with this work, and he just returned from Kabayo in Rwanda and had viewed and been an onlooker to a massacre, working with 24 UN peacekeeping people, doctors and nurses from Australia. He was there documenting their work, and it was the anniversary of the Civil War, and the captain of the local guard went to the top of the hill to the cathedral, gave a passionate speech to his soldiers about what had happened a year ago, and all of them had relatives who had been killed, so they came out of the cathedral and started hacking into the crowd. In the middle of all of that, George comes across this man who's in a yellow coat, reading the Bible in French. Blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are you. So the Sermon on the Mount. And he said, in the midst of this appalling situation with people acting like cattle, scared, here's somebody who's reminding people of their humanity. And so that for George, who has quite, I wouldn't say he's Christian, doesn't go to church, he's just very sensitive to religious or spiritual things. So he found that the image that helped him cope. Came home, spent all night painting this work, done in about 10, 12 hours, as the means by which, in the middle of that horrifying situation, this is something that he could hang on to, and makes an affirmation about the role of religion or faith, perhaps in the midst. And these are some of the shots of the camp, because people had come here because the UN peacekeeping force was there. They thought they would be protected on the anniversary. They also came here because there'd been visions. Some school kids had seen visions of the Mary and received messages. And so George has gone back to these works a number of times. Really marks an important departure for him, and trying to find the way in which art might confront us and invite our ethical response, because we live in a world of violence and terror. And it seems to me he asks the question, well, where do we find Jesus? Is Jesus here amongst these suffering kind of experiences of people who are victims, who've been subject to disfiguration, and they return our gaze and they invite us to respond in some ethical kind of way. So the Blake Committee had an emergency meeting after this, because some members of the Blake Committee thought this was too political. It's too over the top. The story's too much, and the painting it smells of oil paint, like it was just painted yesterday, and there was a bit of a reaction and discussion again, still in 1995, 38 years later, about, well, what is the function of art and religion? What, images of Jesus, what should they do? And a number of the committee threatened to resign, and unfortunately they didn't. But we held that tension, and those members of the committee had this long motion, in future, the Blake Prize will be about religious art. Religious art is works that are deemed to be of saints or so they were putting forward that we needed to define the edges around what this is, and in their wisdom, the committee chose otherwise and said, well, we'll trust the artist. If they're submitting a work, then they think it's kosher, and whether it is or not, we'll treat it with respect as a perspective. So there's an interesting occurrence of Jesus in Guido's work from time to time. It's unexpected. He's a war artist. He's concerned with the great story we're currently in our time, this age of terrorism and this conflict between Eastern, Islamic worlds, Middle East and America, and all the virtue and hopes that are caught up in all that rhetoric. The other unexpected place where Jesus has occurred is in the work of Reg Mombassa, who sometimes is relegated to pop culture because he's funny. His work's ironic. It makes you laugh, but it leaves you, I think, with a sting. There's a longer kind of edge to his work. I was at art school with Reg at East Sydney Tech, and very nonchalant sort of guy. I don't remember him a great deal, but he became part of the band Mental as Anything, who've gone on to have a great career in Australian music. But he suddenly got into this Australian Jesus, the search for the Australian Jesus. And I think it's really illuminating, a bit confronting, and just warning you, this will be the most confronting image coming up. But here's Mambo Faith. It's first seen on a T-shirt, it's tongue-in-cheek, but there's this sort of afterglow, or it's I don't know, you're all into The Simpsons, of course, you watch that comic program, or Wayne's World. When you say something profound, you say, oh, love is not. So it's a postmodernist thing where you kind of say something genuine, but everyone's already said that in history before anyway, and you're really only quoting somebody else. And you say not to negate it, but then there's this afterglow that says yes. So I don't know whether that makes sense to anyone. Maybe that's a pop culture reference, but it seems to me it kind of examples this awkwardness that Australians feel about talking about religion, or talking particularly about icons of religion, and yet there's this embarrassed sort of maybe. So there's this kind of maybe in Reg Mombassa's work, where he's making a joke. So here's Jesus at the football, and there's not much food around, so he multiplies the pies and beer. What a mate! What a mate! So Jesus becomes the best mate, and Reg is really impressed with those sort of ordinary blokes. There's a very male culture in his work who do good things. He said that's to be applauded, because life's pretty brutal. And Reg, when I talked to him about his work, talked for long around male brutality. He talked about being a skinny kid who was sick, and he was pushed over at school, and grew up in Auckland for a while, and he was pushed around a lot. He remembered his childhood as being one where he was subject to male violence and that schoolyard kind of experience, where people work out the power structures and who's in the pecking order, this kind of brutality of finding your sense of masculinity. And so this Jesus figure turns out to be the good guy who carries a form of masculinity in his presence. So he does good things for his mates. Here is a work that Reg submitted to the Blake Prize, and it's The Suffering Servants. It's not long after that bloody movie that came out with Mel Gibson directed, The Passion of Christ. I knew it had a religious term to it. But that movie, which I haven't seen, so I won't say anything about it. But this is the suffering figure, and he's got a telegraph pole on his back, so he's trying to find a way of expressing within our own culture. And this extraordinary image, which I think is really interesting. Here is a solar-powered Jesus bottle. So Reg found a picture in a magazine about American outsider artists, sort of self-taught artists who had the figure of Jesus turned into a little bottle. He thought, oh, that's kind of cute. And then he's bleeding, so he's a form of nourishment out in the bush, and he's plugging himself into the sun. I just think there's something worth thinking about in this image. I think because if I wanted a saviour, if I wanted a figure of Jesus that could save Australia in this current climate of facing the future, how would we insert the Christian story into being a remedial sense of hope in the face of climate change? So here's this really cute, irritating, funny image that I would choose to take seriously about what does the gospel offer the future of the world, and how we deal with our gross selfishness and consumption of goods over against our care for the planet. So Reg is not a Christian, he doesn't go to church, but he has enormous respect for the function of these institutions. He grew up to the age of 14 with Bible comics. His family were very religious, they all went to church, and he had this long history of these, I've never seen them, but I don't know what kids use them now, but they come from America with Jesus and doing things, and it was all that comic book kind of thing, and that's why he does the work he does. He's actually working out of a biblical illustration kind of model. Then this image, which is a more recent one, he painted it for a contemporary Stations of the Cross project that was on in Sydney last year. This is a really difficult image, and if you're going to take offence at anything tonight, this is probably the one you could take offence at. Here Jesus is stripped bare. It's one of the latest Stations of the Cross, and Jesus has male and female genitalia. So what is the artist saying? And of course he doesn't say, so the image is a bit disturbing and irritating. It's unsettling, and so you do have to sit with that for a little bit. But I think he's making a comment about those who suffer, those who are oppressed, and those who are dealt cruelly with, those who are physically attacked are those who are on the margins. So in the current debate about marriage and about the conduct of marriage, and the church has been traditionally a strong policer of gender roles, what it is to be male, what it is to be female, things like that. So this is certainly not a church image. It's not a theological image perhaps, but it's an image which questions, you end up having to think about your assumptions. Well, what do I think about maleness? Does Jesus carry maleness? Does the female gender carry something also about God? Starts to unpack my prejudices. Religious images do create responses. And in 2008, I went through this quite incredible experience of having awarded the Blake Prize the night before, and then being woken up on my mobile phone with several hundred phone calls, one after the other, as fast as I could answer the phone, because the Daily Telegraph had published this story. For God's sake, and two artists in the Blake Prize are parodying and attacking religion. The Daily Telegraph's like is it the Herald Sun here? Is that the other paper you have? Not The Age, the other one. Yep. So there was no stories that day. No sports heroes had taken drugs or anything else. So all of a sudden art was on the front cover of the paper, and the story goes that artists, freewheeling, terrible, atheistic, whatever, they were attacking religion, and so we had to deal with the onslaught. This is one of the works, and the artist has simply gone and got a little Catholic statue of the Virgin Mary and perhaps brightened it up a little and put a burqa on the head. Now really there's nothing quite controversial about that, because this is probably what Mary would have looked like historically. Would have wore a veil in public and been, you would not speak to women in public, and women very rarely would have gone outside the home, as is the custom in many countries even now. So we had the whole controversy in the local Muslim community and blah, 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 and someone's going to get offended and stuff. And then this work, which was a lenticular print of two faces, you turn one way, turn the other way. So Osama bin Laden and this very kitschy image of Jesus from the 19th century. And the artist was simply saying that, we live in a media culture where Osama bin Laden has become the object of evil, and Jesus is this sort of opposite good. So it just makes you a bit more careful about where you reside your objective evil, because if Osama bin Laden is evil, then we are then justified taking military action and it'll give you permission to do all sorts of things. So she's just making us aware of the power of images. This got totally out of control. I went to the gallery at 10 in the morning, like just a couple of hours later, and Channel 9, Channel 7, Channel 2, CNN, and they all wanted to interview me because here was a story that goes to the heart of Australian culture at the moment about tensions around religious allegiance, how we feel about Muslim people and the nature of terrorism. This is the big story of our time. And so the media were trying to make it into a very cardboard, one black and white kind of thing. They asked me about the death threats to the artists, so I had to stop the interview and ring the artists to actually find out about the death threats, and there were no death threats. But the story got on to AAP, and the story appeared the next day in the New York Times, Washington Post, South America, India, Pakistan. The story went 250 newspapers around the world. I love art. I'm an evangelist for art. I want everyone to love it. And it was very difficult to be in the middle of this spotlight where art was being understood to be generating such hatred. Or had it just opened up hatred that was already there? But I was struck by a phone call I got in the afternoon around 3 o'clock from a lady in Victoria, a very pious Catholic woman, who said, when I saw that on the newspaper, it was as if it jumped out at me and kicked me in the stomach. And I've thought about that a lot, and I realised that, for her and her growing up in a system of devotion, that she has this archaeological level that deeply down in her belly somewhere, even beyond, underneath consciousness, there is this order that's ordered visually around how the world is. It's about mothers and faithfulness and these pious images. And she found these playful images too confronting. So blasphemy has a positive aspect in that it makes us aware of the kind of visual assumptions that we bring. And I find, in some sense, in a lighter way, Christian congregations are often attached. Ministers sometimes try to change things, or some bright young thing comes along and wants to do something different, and then people are suddenly deeply attached to an object or how things have been done, because that's somehow become how things are. And we attach ourselves, and then we become trapped, unable to move and change, because we have attached ourselves to a certain kind of behaviour or a kind of view. And I think that's a really poor antidote to an experience of God, basically. I think part of the exercise of seeing Jesus is to realise our capacity to be iconoclasts. We attach ourselves to a certain view, and we feel confronted when we meet someone from another culture who's got another view. We should never live with small ambitions or small visions of God. Otherwise, we end up worshipping a God like this. I think this is the God that some Christians worship in Australia, a God who's tough in the political realm, who wants to exercise that kind of ability to get down off. This is a parody and a very playful image. Or is the church this overblown chandelier of self-importance that's about to crash in the ground? It's another image from the Blake. In the background, the Last Supper's going on, so it's a religious image, but the artist has just focused on this chandelier, and I think what he's saying is that you become so obsessed with your capacity for light giving that you're about to collapse under your own weight of self-righteousness. So I'll leave you with this a final image, and invite some discussion. I hope that there's been something you've seen that you'll remember or incite some thoughtfulness. Here is Margaret Acklin's traditional painting, and this was a project the Uniting Church did in I think something, and done by the comment that in many churches we have depictions of the Last Supper, and it's 12 blokes sitting around the table. How does that represent what the church is in terms of being a community of women and men? We've taken Leonardo's version as the version. And Leonardo painted it for a refectory of men who sat in front of it on the same table. So they would see in the context of their own lives, they too were partaking of bread every morning, lunch and dinner. So it was an image that thoroughly spoke to them about their context. That image is the most reproduced image in all of history. Leonardo's Last Supper is on tea towels and stuff. So it reinforces this idea that only men were at the table. So some people think that's actually Leonardo was there. So here is one artist's response, and she has Jesus' back to us. So we can't see what Jesus looks like. And at the head of the table is a woman who's breastfeeding. Oh, could this be an image of God, the nurturer, that through the physicality of our bodies and our caressing and tenderness we express who or what God is? And then around the table we kind of look at the people, and some of them are looking at Jesus, and there's that little tiny face down here, look, the little child, and that child's looking at us saying, what are you doing here? Oh, what am I doing here? And then this woman turns and looks at us, so we're being addressed by the figures around the table, all urgently listening to Jesus' response, and then here at the edge is these two figures weeping. It's the Last Supper. So this is her conclusion, is that you can't paint, you can't depict, you can't represent Jesus, because it's more than just one human face, but perhaps we see the face of Jesus reflected in the diversity of experience and humanity around the table, which kind of reinforces the meanings of the meal. So that brings us to the end, and just to say that images are important. Images invite responses, sometimes they provoke responses, they seduce us, they allure us, they make us angry, they prompt us, they remind us, they make us feel good. Choose wisely the images you choose to live by. Amen.